The forest was engulfed in mist, as if hiding their little reality from the world. He and she stepped through the branches, which seemed to reach out to them like living creatures, brushing against their clothes and faces. The woman's flickering gaze, her anxious breathing, all indicated that they were not alone. Anticipation overwhelmed her soul, but she tried not to show it. Every step was a challenge, every stop an opportunity for their enemies to spot them. He walked beside her, silent, but his presence was felt. A strong, confident figure, ready to protect as soon as a threat arose. She didn't understand how he could remain so calm. He had always been reserved, almost cold, but it didn't frighten her. On the contrary, she could feel the warmth and concern in his eyes. The fabric of his coat was caked with dirt. His face was scarred, but his gaze remained clear, full of determination. He knew they were on the verge of something great, perhaps the last great event of their lives. He couldn't allow himself to be afraid despite all that lay ahead. After all, for her sake he was willing to sacrifice everything. She could feel his shadow slipping behind her, her world becoming calmer, knowing this man was near. "We can't go on like this for much longer," she paused, throwing a quick glance at him, trying to catch even a shadow of doubt in his eyes. But he only gritted his teeth and raised a hand to stop her, directing his gaze into the darkening forest. The fog was thickening, time was running out. She didn't realize what he was willing to do, but she knew. He wouldn't be afraid. His shoulders were tense, but there was something steadfast in that tension, something determined that drew her in. And despite everything, she couldn't help but feel a strange affection for this man who was willing to go through any challenge for her. The fog grew thicker and thicker, and the forest seemed like a living thing, ready to swallow them at any moment. Every rustle, every sound in the branches was like a portent of trouble. She felt her heart clench with fear. She couldn't understand what it was that frightened her, the forest, the threat outside, or the fact that here, in this shadow, he could disappear, just like everything they had experienced. Their journey was long, and the future ahead was unpredictable. Suddenly, he stopped. She stood beside him, not realizing what was happening. He looked collected, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. She felt his hand slide across the knife blade, and her heart clenched. She knew something was going to happen, but she didn't want to know what it was. "We must part." His voice was quiet, but harder than ever. She froze. A slight shiver ran through her body. What did he say? She thought, but didn't dare ask out loud. She was sure he wasn't joking. His decision was as inevitable as the trials they would face. "You have to go alone," he added, looking straight into her eyes, and there was no doubt in his gaze. She shook her head. It was impossible. How could one let him go? How could she leave this man with whom she had gone through so many trials? "No, I can't leave you here. We'll get through this together." Her voice shook with emotion, but he only gritted his teeth. "You don't understand. You'll live." "I'm not. This is the only chance you have to save yourself." His words were harsh, but they left no room for doubt. She knelt, her heart clenched in pain. How could she agree to this? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. He grabbed her shoulders and lifted her off the ground. His arms were strong and his face was stern and determined. He knew he had to do this for her life, and despite all the pain, he was willing to go all the way. "Please." Her voice had a tone of desperation, but he was adamant. "You can't just disappear, can you?" She tried to reach for him again, but he pulled back. "Goodbye." His words were his last, and they echoed in her soul. He disappeared into the fog. She was left standing, clutching his last item in her hands, the very chain he had always carried with him. Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't let herself cry. It was the moment she realized she no longer had the right to be weak. He had been her protection, her light, and now he was gone. But she had to move on. He had said she had to live. She had to live for him. The fog seemed to consume all her thoughts. Each step became heavy and an overwhelming pain clutched her chest. But she couldn't go back. She couldn't leave his sacrifice to waste. She kept walking, though each step she took detached herself from what she and he had created. Each step took her farther and farther away from the moment they were together. She walked through the forest, clutching the chain in her hands, and thought about how she would live her life without him. Maybe this chain was her last chance to find him, the last thread that connected her to the one she had lost. But even in the midst of this fear and pain, she couldn't help but feel that he was there for her. Wherever he was always still a part of her life. Darkness engulfed the forest, and the only source of light was the flickering fire smoldering by their campfire. Suddenly, the forest became unbearably quiet, and every rustle made her heart skip a beat. She looked around, but his face remained calm, as if everything that was happening was nothing but just another test to be passed. But she knew things had changed. The farther they walked in this forgotten place, the more she felt everything around her tighten into a vice. "We have to be careful." Her voice faintly trembled as she peered into the fog that grew thicker and thicker. She could feel the place pressing in, as if nature itself was trying to stop them. But he did not take his eyes off the far road. "We can't drag it out." His words were short, but there was a heaviness lurking in them, as if he had already decided something but didn't want to tell her. She tried to figure out what was lurking in his demeanor. He was too silent, as if he was thinking about something important that he didn't want to tell her, and even though she felt that something was about to happen, she still couldn't understand why he didn't tell her openly. Every second of this silence was becoming unbearable. Suddenly, unable to bear it, she grabbed his shoulder. "Why aren't you saying anything? What's the matter with you?" He turned to her, and her gaze met his eyes full of determination. There was no fear in them, only the certainty that everything they had done before would now decide their fate. "I have to stay." His words sounded like a sentence. She didn't immediately realize what he meant, but when it came to her heart clenched in her chest. He stood in front of her as if he had already said goodbye. She couldn't understand why. "What are you saying?" Her voice was filled with panic. She didn't want to hear what he was saying. You can't stay." He put his hand on her shoulder and looked into her eyes with an expression that made her words stick in her throat. He was determined. All she could do was stare at him, feeling her heart being torn apart. She wanted to say something, but his gaze stopped her. He knew there was no turning back in this situation. "You don't understand." He leaned a little closer, and the stars reflected in his eyes as if he was ready to do the unthinkable. "This is the only way for you to survive. I have to stay here so you can save yourself." She took a step back. Her mind kept spinning, but she couldn't find the words to stop him. She couldn't believe he was so determined to disown her. They had walked this path together, and now he was choosing to be alone. It was too cruel. The fog grew thicker and thicker, and the forest seemed to shrink around them. Night had already come, but not a single star was visible in the sky. Everything was consumed by this silence that was becoming more and more intense. He stood in front of her as if he were on the last line of defense. She realized it wasn't just fear, not just necessity. He was making a decision that was not an easy one. Her words, her attempts to talk him down, sounded like an echo that didn't reach his ears. He knew this moment had come. He had to sacrifice himself to save her. This was the way it was meant to be. This was the way their long and arduous ordeal was meant to end. "You know I can't do otherwise." His voice was calm, but there was a gravity to what he was about to do. He was willing to give up his life for her. She, on the other hand, couldn't believe it, and her soul filled with horror that he had to make such a decision. He saw her lips trembling, her eyes filling with tears. He walked over to her, and not knowing what to say, just hugged her, transferring all his strength to her. She cried, and those tears seemed so familiar to him, so painful. But he knew, for her to survive, He had to take this step. "I can't lose you," she whispered softly, but her voice was drowned in the silence of the night. He pulled away from her and looked into her eyes, and those seconds felt like an eternity. He felt his heart pounding with every look she gave him, but he knew she would live. He had to leave her for her life, and the pain was unbearable. But he couldn't let her stay here, in this world full of danger. "You will live. I promise." His words sounded like a sentence, and when he looked away again, she realized it was really happening. There was light in his eyes, but for a moment a shadow slid across his face as he took a step back. He knew this was the moment of goodbye. He had to stay, he had to sacrifice himself. She stood before him and her heart was tearing apart. All she wanted was not to let him go, not to let this happen. But he was adamant. He'd given her a chance to survive. "Please don't do this." Her voice was full of desperation. She took a step forward, but he raised his hand, stopping her. He knew her life was something he could save. "This is my choice." His words were short, but decisive. He turned to her again and took one last look at her and disappeared into the fog, leaving her standing in the silence of the night. He was gone, but his words, Artie's, remained in her heart. She couldn't figure out how to live without him, but she knew she had to continue on her path, and that path led her to a future where his sacrifice was the meaning of her survival. With him gone, the forest seemed even darker and lifeless. The fog wrapped around her body like an invisible web, and despite its coldness, pain burned inside her. Each step took her further away from him, and her heart shrank with each passing second. She couldn't understand how her life kept going when a piece of her world was gone with him. She stood in the fog like a lost soul who can't find her way home. She walked, not knowing exactly where she was going, but her feet were leading her forward on their own. Maybe she had dreams of reunion in her mind, but the reality was cruel. He was gone, and she was alone, in a world that had become empty and lifeless. Everything she saw was bleak and cold. Her eyes could find no light in this world full of unknowns. The fog obscured even the simplest of details, as if all of nature was trying to obscure her pain. She stopped and looked around, but there was no one. It was as if he had never existed at all, or maybe he hadn't been in this world for a long time. She couldn't understand why she was so tormented by this feeling of emptiness. Maybe her soul couldn't accept that he wasn't around. Every thought of him brought new anguish. "You said I would live." Her words, like the wind scattered through the empty forest, found no response. She was alone, too alone. She sat on the ground, covering her face with her hands. Those tears she had tried to hold back were now pouring out in rivers. He had told her that she had to live, that her life was his sacrifice. But how could she live if her heart was torn? How could she walk the path if there was nothing but emptiness and pain at the end of it? There was nothing but fear in her eyes. Fear of losing him forever. Fear that his sacrifice hadn't brought what she so desperately desired, his return. But despite all these thoughts, she knew that she had to keep going, that she had no right to stop. He had said she had to survive, and she had to fulfill his request. Time seemed to move slowly, and every second without him stretched like an eternity. But something inside her began to change. Before she could be completely consumed by grief, something resembling hope flashed somewhere deep inside her. He couldn't be gone forever. It was impossible. He was with her, in her heart, in her thoughts. And maybe it was this reminder of him that was her guiding star in this dark and cold forest. She stood up, leaning on her strength. She had to go forward. He had left her with this duty, a duty to find him, a duty to endure this pain and go on with her life. She could feel his presence inside her, his words echoing in her head. "You have to live." And now she knew she couldn't just give up. She began to move forward, once again consumed by that feeling of loneliness. She didn't know what lay ahead of her, but she knew this was her path. Even though her legs were tired and her heart was heavy, she was still walking. She knew he wouldn't want to see her broken. He would want her to keep moving, no matter how hard it was for her. They were connected. Even though she was alone, she could still feel him near her. The feeling was so strong that her steps became confident despite the weakness that was inside. He left her with this duty and she accepted it. She would seek him out despite everything. She had to find him. "I will find you," she told herself, feeling her spirit strengthen. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow made not to him, but to herself. She would live. She would fight. And perhaps one day, that fight would lead her to him. Time passed, but the world around her did not change. The forest still hid her from the rest of the world, leaving only fog and darkness. She walked on, not knowing where the path was leading her, but despite the fog, she felt she was moving somewhere. Perhaps she was going nowhere, but her soul couldn't allow her to believe that none of this made sense. Each step she took became heavier. She kept walking, not knowing how much time had passed or how much more she had to go through. But one thing was certain, she couldn't go back. She couldn't just give up, because then his sacrifice would lose all meaning. She had to find him. She had to do it. With each step, she felt more and more alone, but a faint but sure spark of hope burned in her soul. "I will find you," she whispered to herself again, and that repetitive mantra kept her moving forward. He was gone, leaving her alone, but she knew she was not alone. He was with her, in her heart, and until that spark was extinguished, she would not give up. She would keep going until she found him. It was her only goal, her only hope of salvation. With each step, the fog grew thicker, but she kept moving. Pain, loneliness, fear. All these feelings were swallowed up by her determination. She had to keep going, and she did. Step by step, day by day, she couldn't believe there was still room in the world for her pain, because she was willing to find it, no matter how hard it was. Her journey began with slight uncertainty, but the further she walked, the stronger her spirit became. At this point, the forest didn't just seem like a place to get lost, but something that was the canvas of a life she had to walk through. The fog grew thicker, and the roots of the trees, at times, seemed to put themselves under her feet, ready to trip her up so that she would stumble and fall. But she did not fall. Every step she took was a step forward, even if it was heavy and full of doubt. She was no longer afraid of loneliness. It became her companion. She knew that all she had to do was find it, and this knowledge led her to a decision. She would seek him relentlessly despite all obstacles. Sometimes, as she walked through the dense bushes, she caught herself thinking that everything around her was just an illusion, her consciousness creating obstacles. But she couldn't stop. This path was her goal. With each step, hope grew in her chest, but also doubt. What if he didn't come back? What if he was no longer in this world? These thoughts kept her on her toes, but she kept walking. Her only light was the image that remained in her memory, the image of his gaze, his words, "You must live." She couldn't let herself forget him. He was with her. She began to look for traces of him. Though much time had passed, she believed she would find something that would prove he was alive. It wasn't just faith. It was her mission, her only goal. She explored every corner of the forest, every tree, every rock. For a moment, she thought she could hear his footsteps, his breathing, his whispering in the wind. It was almost unbelievable, but that was how she felt him, and the feeling was real. He was somewhere near, she was sure. For a moment, her gaze stopped on something she thought was familiar, a piece of his clothing stained with blood, left behind in her haste. Her heart beat faster. She couldn't believe her eyes. It was his footprint. She grabbed the cloth but couldn't take her eyes off this evidence. She felt her body fill with determination. She couldn't turn back anymore. That was the moment she realized. She wasn't just going forward. She was finding him. With each step, she felt her own strength drying up more and more. The journey was long, and each day spent searching drained her body more and more. She was losing strength, but she couldn't stop. Every morning she woke up full of determination, but as soon as evening came, she felt that her strength was running out. But the next morning she would get up again with the thought of him. Her heart felt no more pain, though she continued to be tormented inwardly. She only felt his absence and could not allow herself to stop. The path was hard, but not a single drop of rain, not a single fall could throw her off course. She was going where she hoped he was, and despite her doubts, she kept looking for him. Day after day, step after step. Through the fog, she saw him. It was so sudden that her heart nearly stopped. For a moment she froze, unable to believe her eyes. There he stood before her, the one she had been searching for, the one who had left her for her safety. But now he was alive. He stood at the edge of her line of sight, like a ghost that had suddenly become reality. He was not as she remembered him. His face was haggard, his eyes were sad and pained, but at the same time they were full of light. He was alive, but his whole appearance told her that he had been through something terrible. She took a step forward. Her heart was beating with incredible force. Every moment seemed endless. But she couldn't stop. She walked toward him as if she couldn't believe she was finding him, that this meeting was real. He stepped toward her too, but as soon as their gazes met, he froze. Everything that had been between them seemed to dissolve in that moment. There were no words or explanations, just a silent confession that spoke volumes about what they had both experienced. She couldn't hide her tears. They flowed down her cheeks like rain in a misty forest. You're alive!" Her voice was barely audible. It shook with excitement and relief. He couldn't find the words to answer. Instead, he simply stepped closer and took her hand. All words stayed in his heart because he knew this meeting was more than just a reunion. It was a forgiveness that came too late, and at the same time, a release. "I thought you were—" She couldn't finish her sentence because she couldn't believe this was all happening. He just smiled at her with pain in his eyes. "I thought you would forget me, but you found me." His words were simple, but there was so much meaning in them. She squeezed his hand tighter. It was the moment their world became whole again. But she knew their ordeal wasn't over yet. "We can't lose each other again." Her voice was firm, full of confidence that now that they had found each other, nothing could keep them apart. He didn't answer, but his eyes glittered. All he could do was stand by and let those words penetrate his soul. He was alive, and they were together again. But despite the reunion, there was something that lingered. The old pain hadn't gone away, and there were new challenges ahead. Everything was intertwined. Pain, joy, fear, and love. But this moment of reunion gave her strength. She knew they had a chance now, a chance to start over and walk this path together. They sat side by side, embraced, and were silent. But there were more than 1,000 words in their silence. With every look, with every touch, they told each other their story of pain and fear. He had been alone all this time, just like her. He had struggled, just like her. But now that they were together again, the world was no longer so empty. Emotions overwhelmed them, and it didn't matter that they didn't speak. Everything was clear, without words. "I've been through so much," he admitted quietly, his voice full of bitterness and regret. "Me too," she replied, and her eyes filled with tears. She realized that their love had gone through something immeasurably difficult, but it was stronger than what they had been through. Now that their world was connected again, they felt that there was not just a fight ahead of them, but a life full of hope. Their love was with them, like an unruly force that could overcome any obstacle. She rested her head on his shoulder, and though the world around them remained dangerous, they found the strength to hope. They didn't know what lay ahead of them, but they knew one thing: they were no longer alone. With each passing day, their bond grew stronger. They were ready to begin a new phase of their lives, knowing that they could conquer any hardship because they were together. Even though the journey was still far, they weren't afraid to go forward, knowing that they now had light in their heart. The fog was clearing, and with each step, there was more and more light in their lives. She couldn't believe they were back together. It had been so long, they had been through so many trials, and now they were standing side by side. Their hearts, which once seemed broken, were beating in unison again. Though the forest remained the same, this land they now explored together seemed different. It was full of new possibilities and hope that they gave to each other. "I don't know how we survived all of this," she said, looking into his eyes. But there was gratitude in her voice, as if life itself had come back to her, as an answer to her silent pleas. He was silent, but his gaze spoke more than words. He looked at her as if she were a bright fire that brought him out of the darkest corners of his soul. His hand rested on her shoulder, and in that moment, she realized that they had gone through death. But despite everything, they were alive again. "We survived." His voice was low, full of a strength that allowed them to go on. "We survived everything." He was right. Everything they had endured, everything they had lost, was now behind them. Their new life was just beginning. The world they had left behind was full of fear and pain, but here in this forest, among these green expanses, they could begin again. It was the beginning of something new, something that could be their true home. But despite this new hope, there was still some shadow. No matter how hard it was, no matter how painful the memory of loss, they were here. They were together. And that was enough to live on. They kept walking, their steps sure and firm, but the shadow of what they had endured still hung in the air. Sometimes he could feel her eyes on him, full of pain and fear, and he knew she was thinking about the past. She tried to forget, but the pain stayed with her. It was inescapable. She couldn't just let go of what she had lost, but with each passing day she grew stronger. She learned to look forward to the future, even though her soul still ached. "I can't forget." Her words were quiet, but there was so much pain in them that he felt his heart clench. He knew that this pain would be with them, that it would follow them wherever they went. But he also knew that they would fight it together. They weren't alone anymore. And that knowledge gave her strength. "I'm not asking you to forget." His answer was soft, full of care and love. "We can't forget, but we can make sure that this pain doesn't destroy us." Her gaze met his, and for a moment she felt the weight of the past dissolve. She was no longer alone in her grief. He was there for her, and that was all she needed. Now they could move forward. She took a deep breath and her shoulders relaxed slightly. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she wasn't afraid. They were together, and that was enough. They kept walking, not knowing what lay ahead of them. Time passed, and the forest seemed to open up new paths, new possibilities. And though they were still far from their home, this place became their new home. Not a place, but a feeling they had sought and now found. It was near, in their hands, in their hearts. But there was still that shadow of doubt. Would their love be strong enough to withstand all the trials they would go through? Would their bond be able to survive everything they left behind? These were questions that wouldn't leave her, but she realized that their love wasn't just about their past. It was something more. This love was their strength, their support in their most difficult moments. It was eternal. Suddenly, amidst the fog, she felt his hand squeeze hers tighter. He turned toward her and stopped. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she sensed that this was the moment when everything changed. "You know we're going to go through a lot," he said quietly, his eyes full of determination. "But I'm ready. I'm ready to walk with you until the end." Her heart sighed. That was exactly what she wanted to hear. With him, she could survive anything. He was her light, her guiding star. They were ready. "We're together." Her words came out with such confidence that even the forest around them seemed to freeze. And that was enough. Though there were still many challenges ahead, they knew that as long as they were together, they could survive anything because their love was the strongest of all. And that was the most important thing. Everything else didn't matter. Together, they were walking into a new world, and that world was theirs. It was their chance to start over, a chance they couldn't pass up, and they were ready to take it, one step at a time.